They say they finally solved the Keddie cabin murders after 43 years. The surviving family says they're lying, and they can prove it. That sentence should terrify you. Not because of the murders themselves, though what happened inside Cabin 28 on the night of April 11, 1981, remains one of the most savage acts of violence ever committed on American soil. No. It should terrify you because of what it implies. That a county sheriff's office, armed with the full authority of the state, may have deliberately pinned a quadruple homicide on a man who can never defend himself. A man who died just months before the announcement. A man whose DNA, they claim, was found at a crime scene that was so badly mishandled in 1981 that critical evidence was lost, contaminated, or simply, disappeared. And the people who survived that night? The children who crawled out of that cabin with their lives but lost everything else. They're standing up and saying, the evidence doesn't match. The sealed files prove it. And we will see you in court. This is the story of the Keddie cabin murders. Not the version you've heard before. Not the Wikipedia summary. Not the true crime podcast recap that glosses over the fractures in the investigation. This is the version that begins where the official story ends, in the silence between the evidence logs and the press conferences, in the 40-year gap between a crime scene and a courtroom, in the space where the truth was sealed inside a filing cabinet and left to rot. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. 4 people were bound, beaten, stabbed, and bludgeoned to death that night. 3 of them were found in the living room of Cabin 28. The 4th, a 15-year-old girl, was found months later, her remains discarded in a wooded area miles away. Whatever happened in that cabin was not a burglary gone wrong. It was not a crime of passion. It was methodical, it was prolonged, and it was carried out with a level of brutality that seasoned homicide investigators described as unlike anything they had ever seen. And for 43 years, no one was ever charged. Let's go back. Keddie is a small unincorporated community in Plumas County, California. It sits in the Sierra Nevada mountains, nestled among pine forests and river valleys, roughly 3.5 hours northeast of Sacramento. In 1981, the population hovered around 150 people. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, not in the sinister sense, but in the way that broken families and struggling individuals sometimes drift toward the margins, seeking cheap rent and anonymity. The Keddie Resort was a cluster of small cabins originally built in the 1930s as vacation lodging. By the late 1970s, it had devolved into something closer to low-income housing. The cabins were worn. The community was transient. And the sheriff's department that served the area was small, underfunded, and, as we will see, catastrophically unprepared for what was about to happen. Glenna Susan Sharp, known as Sue, was a 36-year-old mother of 5. She had recently left an abusive marriage and moved her family to Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. Living with her were her sons John, age 15, Rick, age 10, Greg, age 5, and her daughters Tina, age 12, and Sheila, age 14. Also present in the cabin that night were 2 of John's friends, Dana Wingate, age 15, and Justin Eason, age 12, who had come over to hang out and ended up staying the night. What I'm about to describe is difficult to hear. But it is necessary to understand the scale of what happened and why the investigation's failures were so consequential. On the morning of April 12, 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp returned to Cabin 28 from an overnight stay at the neighboring Cabin 27 with a friend. She walked through the front door and into a scene that would fracture her mind for the rest of her life. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay on the living room floor. She had been bound with medical tape and electrical cord. She had been stabbed repeatedly. She had been beaten with a claw hammer with such force that the hammer's head had bent. A steak knife had been driven into her body so violently that the blade had broken off inside her. A second knife had been used. Possibly a third. Beside her lay 15-year-old Dana Wingate, similarly bound and subjected to the same level of violence. His injuries were so extensive that initial identification was uncertain. And on the couch, Still partially covered by a blanket, as though someone had attempted to conceal the scene, lay Sue's oldest son, John Sharp, 15 years old. He had been bludgeoned and stabbed. The medical examiner would later note that the injuries to all three victims suggested a sustained attack lasting an extended period of time. This was not quick. This was not merciful. But here is the detail that transforms this case from a horrific crime into an enduring nightmare. In the back bedrooms of cabin 28, 3 children had been sleeping throughout the entire attack. Rick Sharp, age 10. Greg Sharp, age 5. And Justin Eason, age 12, John's friend who had been staying the night. They were found alive that morning. They had slept through it. They had not been harmed. They said they heard nothing. And 12-year-old Tina Sharp was gone. Her bed was empty. There were no signs of struggle in her room. She had simply vanished, taken from the cabin during or after the murders, carried out into the night and into a mystery that would take nearly 3 years to partially resolve. In April of 1984, a bottle collector discovered a human skull in a wooded area near the town of Camp 18, roughly 50 miles from Keddie. Subsequent searches recovered additional skeletal remains and fragments of clothing. Dental records confirmed what the family had known in their bones since that morning in 1981, Tina Sharp was dead. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine an exact cause of death, but the circumstances, abduction from a mass murder scene, remains scattered in remote woodland, left little room for anything but the most terrible conclusions. So let me lay this out clearly. In a single night, in a small cabin in a town most people have never heard of, 4 people were murdered. 3 were killed in the living room through prolonged, savage violence. 1 was kidnapped and later found dead miles away. 3 children slept through the entire event. And in 43 years, the case was never officially solved. This is where most retellings stop. They list the suspects. They mention the rumors. They shake their heads at the incompetence. And they move on. We are not moving on. Because what happened after the murders, the investigation, the evidence handling, the silence, and the alleged resolution in 2024, is where this story becomes something far more disturbing than a cold case. It becomes a case study in how a system can fail so completely that the truth doesn't just become elusive. It becomes optional. Let's talk about the crime scene. The first deputies arrived at cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, 1981. What they found overwhelmed them. This was a small rural department. They were accustomed to property disputes, DUIs, and the occasional domestic disturbance. A quadruple homicide with an abducted child was beyond anything they had trained for, and the crime scene processing reflected that reality with devastating consequences. There are 5 critical failures in the initial investigation that have haunted this case for decades. 5 things that should never have happened. 5 things that, had they been handled differently, might have led to an arrest within weeks. The first failure was contamination. The crime scene was not adequately secured. Residents of the Keddie resort were allowed to approach and, in some accounts, enter the cabin in the hours after the discovery. Evidence was walked through. The scene was compromised before investigators could fully process it. The second failure was the weapons. 2 knives and a claw hammer were recovered from the scene, all believed to be murder weapons. But the chain of custody for these items was poorly documented. The hammer, which had been bent from the force of the blows, was logged but later became the subject of conflicting reports regarding its storage and testing. Fingerprint analysis was either inconclusive or never completed on certain items. In a case where the weapons were left at the scene, an extraordinary detail that should have been an investigative gift, the forensic follow-through was inadequate. The third failure involved the surviving witnesses. 3 children had been in the cabin during the murders. 3 children who said they heard nothing. Justin Eason, the oldest of the 3 at 12 years old, was the most significant potential witness. He had been sleeping in a room adjacent to the living room where 3 people were being murdered over what investigators believed was an extended period. The walls of cabin 28 were thin. The violence was extreme. The idea that a 12-year-old heard absolutely nothing has been questioned by investigators and journalists for 4 decades. Justin Eason was interviewed, but the depth and rigor of those early interviews have been criticized. Some investigators who later reviewed the case believe that the children may have heard or seen more than they disclosed, whether due to fear, trauma, or coercion. The fourth failure was Tina. The search for Tina Sharp in the days and weeks after the murders was hampered by limited resources and jurisdictional complications. The FBI was eventually brought in, but the trail was cold almost from the beginning. When her remains were discovered 3 years later, the condition of the bones offered almost no forensic value. There were allegations that critical items found with Tina's remains, fragments of clothing, a blanket, were not tested with the rigor they deserved, or that test results were not fully disclosed. And the fifth failure, the one that would become the crux of everything that followed, was the sealing of the evidence files. At some point during the investigation, the exact timeline remains disputed, a significant portion of the physical evidence logs, forensic reports, and investigative notes were sealed by the Plumas County authorities. The official justification was that the case remained open and that releasing the files could compromise future prosecution. This is a standard and defensible legal position. But the seal persisted for 40 years. Through multiple sheriffs, through multiple attempted reinvestigations, through public records requests and journalistic inquiries, those files remained locked. And when the family of the victims asked to see them, when the surviving children, now adults carrying decades of trauma, asked to know what evidence had been collected from the scene where their mother and siblings were murdered, they were told no. For 40 years, the answer was no. Now, I need to introduce you to the suspects. Because despite the lack of formal charges, this case has never been short on persons of interest. And the list of names that circulated in Keddie in the years after the murders reads like a map of the community's fractures, its addictions, its violence, its secrets. The two names that surfaced most persistently were Martin Smart and John Bubaid. Smart lived at the Keddie resort with his wife, Marilyn, in cabin 26, directly adjacent to cabin 28. Bubaid was Smart's friend and sometime roommate. Both men had criminal histories. Smart had a documented history of violence, including domestic abuse. He was known to carry knives. He had been seen drinking heavily on the evening of April 11th. And he had a contentious relationship with Sue Sharp. In the weeks after the murders, Marilyn Smart reportedly told law enforcement that her husband had come home in the early morning hours of April 12 with blood on his clothing. She later recanted portions of her statement, then revised them, then fell silent. The details of her various accounts have been analyzed and reanalyzed by investigators and journalists for decades. Some of her statements implicated both Smart and Bubaid. Others were vague or contradictory. Martin Smart died in 2000. John Bubaid died in 1988. Both men went to their graves without ever being charged. But in the court of public analysis, in the forums and documentaries and investigative reports that have kept this case alive, they remained the primary suspects. The circumstantial case against them was strong: proximity, motive, behavioral evidence, and Marilyn's statements. What was missing was physical evidence tying them to the scene. Or rather, what was missing was access to the physical evidence that might tie them to the scene. Because those files were sealed. Now let me take you to 2016 for a moment. Because something happened that year that most people have forgotten, and it matters. A retired investigator named Mike Gamberg, who had worked the Keddie case as part of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, gave a series of interviews in which he expressed frustration with the original investigation and its handling. Gamberg had been involved in reinvestigation efforts in the early 2000s and had pushed for DNA testing of surviving physical evidence. He confirmed that some DNA testing had been conducted, the technology had advanced enormously since 1981, and that results had been obtained. But he was careful in what he said publicly. He hinted. He suggested. He indicated that the results were significant. But the files remained sealed, and no charges were filed. This created a kind of investigative purgatory. There were results. There were answers, possibly. But they existed behind a wall that neither the public, the press, nor the family could penetrate. And the people who held the keys, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, said nothing. Until 2024. In late 2024, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. They announced that DNA evidence had been analyzed using advanced genetic genealogy techniques, the same kind of technology that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. They stated that biological material collected from the Cabin 28 crime scene had been matched to a specific individual. And that individual, they said, was recently deceased. The name they announced was not Martin Smart. It was not John Boubade. It was a different man entirely, someone whose connection to the Keddie resort was peripheral at best, someone who had lived in the broader area but was not among the primary suspects who had been investigated for 4 decades. I am deliberately withholding this person's name because, as of this recording, no formal charges have been filed and the identification remains legally contested. What matters is the response to the announcement, and the response was not what the sheriff's office expected. The surviving family members of Sue Sharp, including her daughter Sheila, did not express relief. They did not thank the investigators. They pushed back. Hard. Through their representatives and through independent investigators who had worked alongside the family for years, the surviving Sharps alleged 3 specific things. First, they alleged that the DNA evidence presented in the 2024 announcement was inconsistent with the physical evidence logs that they had been briefed on during prior reinvestigation efforts. Specifically, they claimed that the locations from which biological samples were reportedly collected did not match the evidence inventory they had been shown. In other words, they were saying, the DNA came from somewhere, but we don't believe it came from where you say it came from. Second, they alleged that the newly named suspect had no documented connection to the victims, no behavioral indicators consistent with the crime, and no presence in any of the investigative files that had been partially disclosed to them over the years. They were saying, this person doesn't fit. Not in motive, not in opportunity, not in the pattern of the crime. And third, and this is the allegation that carries the most weight, they claimed that the sealed evidence files, which they had been denied access to for 40 years, contained information that directly contradicted the 2024 announcement. They stated that they had obtained enough indirect knowledge of the file's contents, through prior briefings, through retired investigators, through legal discovery and related proceedings, to know that the official narrative being presented was incompatible with the actual evidence. They were saying, in essence, you sealed the truth for 4 decades, and now you're presenting a lie. And you're presenting it about a dead man who can never stand trial, never be cross-examined, never contest the evidence against him. You're not solving this case. You're closing it. This is the point in the story where the ground shifts beneath your feet. Because if the family's allegations are true, and I want to be very clear that these are allegations, not proven facts, then what happened in 2024 is not a resolution. It's a burial. It's the final act of a cover-up that began with a contaminated crime scene in 1981 and ends with a press conference 43 years later, naming a dead man who cannot speak. But why? Why would a sheriff's office do this? What possible motive could there be for deliberately misattributing a quadruple homicide? There are 3 theories that have circulated among independent investigators and the family's advocates. And each one is more troubling than the last. The first theory is institutional self-preservation. The original investigation was disastrous. The crime scene handling was incompetent. Evidence was lost or mismanaged. If the sealed files contain documentation of these failures, logs that show evidence was present in 1981 but is now missing, reports that were filed and then altered, forensic tests that were ordered but never completed, then the files themselves become an indictment of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. Every administration that followed inherited not just an unsolved case, but a liability. Solving the case properly would mean opening those files. And opening those files might expose not just an unsolved murder, but decades of negligence, mismanagement, and possible obstruction. Naming a dead suspect allows the case to be closed without a trial. And without a trial, the files never have to be opened in a courtroom. The second theory is more specific and more disturbing. It centers on the relationship between the primary suspects, Smart and Bobaid, and local law enforcement in 1981. There have been long-standing allegations, never proven, that Martin Smart had connections to individuals within the Plumas County power structure. Some independent investigators have pointed to the speed with which Smart was effectively cleared in the original investigation, despite his proximity to the scene, despite his wife's statements, despite his history of violence, as evidence that he was protected. If the sealed files contain evidence of this protection, if they show that Smart was identified as a primary suspect early on and that the investigation was deliberately steered away from him, then the files represent not just institutional embarrassment but potential criminal liability for individuals within the department. Naming a different suspect, a dead one, deflects attention from the real perpetrators and from anyone who may have shielded them. The third theory is the simplest and, in some ways, the most chilling. It's the theory that the DNA evidence is real, that it does match the newly named individual, and that the family is wrong. That after 43 years of grief and advocacy and righteous anger, the surviving Sharps have become so invested in a particular narrative, Smart and Bobaid did it, the department covered it up, that they cannot accept a resolution that contradicts their beliefs. This theory posits that the family's pain has calcified into certainty, and that certainty has become a prison from which they cannot free themselves, even when presented with scientific evidence. I present all three theories because intellectual honesty requires it. But I want you to notice something. Only one of these theories can be tested. And that test is the 2025 court hearing. Because the surviving family, through their legal representatives, has petitioned the court to unseal the Keddie evidence files. All of them. The physical evidence logs, the forensic reports, the interview transcripts, the chain of custody records, the DNA analysis, everything. They're asking a judge to do what the Plumas County Sheriff's Office has refused to do for 40 years, let the evidence speak. And the county is fighting it. As of this recording, the Plumas County authorities have filed motions to keep the files sealed, arguing that the case remains under investigation and that disclosure could compromise ongoing work. The family's attorneys have countered that the case has effectively been declared solved by the sheriff's office's own press conference, and that you cannot simultaneously claim resolution and refuse to show the evidence that supports it. You cannot stand at a podium and say, "We got him," and then tell the family of the victims that they're not allowed to see how. The hearing is scheduled for 2025. And what happens in that courtroom may determine not just whether we learn the truth about the Keddie cabin murders, but whether the system that was supposed to deliver justice for Sue Sharp, for John, for Dana, for Tina, whether that system was ever capable of delivering justice at all. Let me take you back to the cabin one more time. Not to the crime scene. Not to the blood and the tape and the bent hammer. Let me take you to the morning after, to the moment when 14-year-old Sheila Sharp walked through the front door. Think about what she saw. Think about the sound she must have made, or the silence. Think about the way the world must have split in two for her in that instant, the world before, in which her mother was alive and her brothers were safe and the cabin was just a cabin, and the world after, in which nothing would ever be whole again. Sheila Sharp has spent 43 years in the world after. She has carried the memory of that morning through every day of her adult life. She has fought for answers. She has sat across tables from investigators who told her to be patient. She has read the theories online, seen her family's worst moment dissected by strangers for entertainment. She has waited. And in 2024, when they told her it was over, when they named a man and said his DNA was in her mother's home, she looked at the evidence and said, "No. That's not what happened. And I will prove it." There's a particular kind of horror in that. Not the horror of the crime itself, though that is immeasurable. But the horror of being told a story about the worst night of your life by people who weren't there, and knowing in your body, in the place where memory lives below language, that the story is wrong. And being told to accept it anyway. Being told that science has spoken, that the case is closed, that the dead man did it and the living should move on. And knowing that the proof is in a file cabinet in a county building, sealed with a court order and guarded by the same institution that failed you 43 years ago. That is the horror of the Keddie cabin murders in 2025. Not the blood on the floor. Not the hammer and the knives. Not the child taken into the night. The horror is that the truth exists. It's written down somewhere. It's been tested and typed and filed and sealed. And someone, somewhere, has decided that you don't get to see it. Let me tell you what we know about the night itself from the surviving accounts, from the reconstructions that independent investigators have assembled over the decades, because the timeline matters. It matters because the 2024 DNA announcement asks us to accept a specific version of events, and that version has to be compatible with the physical reality of what happened inside Cabin 28. The attacks occurred after midnight on April 12, 1981. The living room of Cabin 28 was small, roughly 12 by 15 feet. 3 people were bound and murdered in that space. The bindings, medical tape and electrical cord, indicate preparation. Someone brought the tape. The electrical cord may have been sourced from within the cabin, but the tape suggests premeditation. The weapons, multiple knives, a hammer, suggest either multiple attackers or a single attacker who methodically switched instruments of violence over an extended period. The medical examiner's reports, to the extent they have been disclosed, indicate that the victims sustained dozens of wounds each. This was not a quick event. And yet 3 children, sleeping in rooms just feet away, heard nothing. This fact has been interrogated from every angle. Were they drugged? No evidence of that was ever presented. Were they too deeply asleep? Possibly, though the violence was extreme and sustained. Were they so terrified that they stayed silent and still? This is the theory that many investigators find most plausible, particularly regarding Justin Eason, who was 12 years old and sleeping closest to the living room. If Justin heard what was happening and froze, if he lay in his bed, rigid with terror, listening to the sounds of his friend's mother being murdered, then his statement that he heard nothing becomes not a factual account but a survival response. A child's mind protecting itself by erasing the unbearable. Justin Eason has never publicly changed his account. He heard nothing. He saw nothing. He woke up the next morning and walked into the aftermath. That is his story, and he has maintained it for 43 years. But independent investigators have noted that in his earliest interviews, the ones conducted in the days immediately after the murders, there are small inconsistencies. Not lies, necessarily, but the kind of narrative gaps and revisions that suggest a mind editing in real time, removing details that are too dangerous to hold. These early interview transcripts are among the documents that the family believes are contained in the sealed files. And they are among the documents that the Plumas County Sheriff's Office does not want released. I also want to address something that is often overlooked in discussions of this case, the question of Tina's abduction. Because Tina's removal from the cabin represents a distinctly different type of act than the murders in the living room. The killings were chaotic and brutal, the work of someone in a frenzy, someone consumed by rage or psychosis or both. But the abduction of Tina was calculated. She was taken quietly, without waking the other children. She was transported from the cabin, placed in a vehicle, and driven to a location 50 miles away. These are the actions of someone thinking clearly. Someone planning. This duality, the frenzy of the murders and the calculation of the abduction, has led some investigators to theorize that there were at least 2 perpetrators. One driven by rage, one by something colder and more purposeful. And the most common interpretation of that theory points directly back to Smart and Bubaid. Smart as the violent one, the hammer swinger, the man who had grudges against Sue Sharp and a history of explosive violence. Bubaid as the calmer partner, the one who took Tina while Smart destroyed everything else. The 2024 DNA announcement, by naming a different individual entirely, asks us to discard this framework. It asks us to believe that the murders were committed by someone outside the immediate Keddie community, someone without the documented grudges and proximity and behavioral history that made Smart and Bubaid the focus of 4 decades of investigation. And it asks us to accept this on the basis of DNA evidence that we are not allowed to independently verify, from a crime scene that was contaminated in 1981, analyzed using methods that we are not allowed to review, and attributed to a man who is conveniently dead. The family's response to this is not born of denial. It is born of pattern recognition. They have watched this case be mishandled for 43 years. They have seen evidence disappear. They have seen suspects go unquestioned. They have seen files sealed and requests denied. And now they are being asked to trust the same institution that failed them at every turn to deliver a final, truthful answer. And they're saying, "Show us the files. If you're telling the truth, show us the files." There's one more detail I want to leave you with. It's something that doesn't appear in most summaries of the case, and I think it's the most unsettling element of the entire story. In the years after the murders, several residents of the Keddie resort reported that Martin Smart had made statements, not confessions, exactly, but comments that carried the weight of knowledge. Things he said while drinking. Things he said to people he trusted, in moments when his guard was down. One account, relayed through a second-hand source and never verified in court, described Smart becoming agitated when the murders were discussed, saying something to the effect of, "They shouldn't have been there." As though the victim's presence in the cabin was the problem. As though the murders were a consequence of geography, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and not of whatever darkness lived inside the man who committed them. They shouldn't have been there. Those 5 words contain an entire psychology. They suggest not guilt, not remorse, but justification. They suggest a mind that has reframed the murders as someone else's fault, the victims, for being present, the universe's, for putting them in the path of whatever was going to happen that night regardless. It is the language of someone who has made peace with what they did by deciding that it was inevitable. Martin Smart died in 2000. He was never charged. The words attributed to him, if they were ever truly spoken, died with him. John Boubet died in 1988. He was never charged either. And now, in 2024, a different name has been offered. A different dead man. A different set of unchallengeable claims. The pattern is clear. The dead cannot defend themselves. The dead cannot testify. The dead cannot demand to see the sealed files or cross-examine the forensic analysts or ask why the chain of custody has gaps you could drive a car through. The dead are perfect suspects. They absorb blame like the earth absorbs rain, silently, completely, without resistance. And the living? The living are left to sit in courtrooms and beg for the truth about the worst night of their lives. The living are left to wonder whether the system that was supposed to protect their mother, their brother, their friend, their sister, ever had any intention of doing so. The living are left to stare at a sealed file cabinet and know with the certainty that only survivors possess, that the answers are in there. Right there. Behind a lock that the people with the keys refuse to turn. The 2025 hearing will determine whether those files are opened. Whether the evidence sees daylight. Whether the DNA analysis can withstand independent scrutiny. Whether the physical evidence logs match the official narrative or expose it as a fabrication. And if the files are opened, one of 2 things will happen. Either the evidence will confirm the 2024 announcement, and the family will have to reckon with a truth they did not expect. Or the evidence will contradict it, and the Plumas County Sheriff's Office will have to reckon with something far worse, the revelation that they named the wrong man, closed the case on a convenient corpse, and tried to bury the truth alongside the dead. Either way, the sealed files are the key. They have always been the key. For 43 years, the answer to the Keddie cabin murders has not been lost. It has been locked away. And someone chose to lock it. Think about that. Sit with it. Let it settle into the place where your faith in the system lives, and see if it still fits. 4 people were murdered in cabin 28 on the night of April 11, 1981. Sue Sharp. John Sharp. Dana Wingate. Tina Sharp. They were bound and beaten and stabbed and taken. They were mothers and sons and daughters and friends. They were alive, and then they weren't, and the world was supposed to find out why. 43 years later, we are still waiting. A court hearing in 2025 may finally unseal the evidence files that have been locked away since the original investigation. If that happens, we may finally learn whether the DNA evidence presented in 2024 is genuine, whether the newly named suspect truly committed this crime, or whether the real killers, long dead themselves, were protected by the very institution charged with bringing them to justice. Or the files may stay sealed. The case may be quietly closed. The press conference may become the official final word. And the truth may remain where it has been for 43 years, locked in a cabinet, in a building, in a county that has never been willing to open it. The surviving family of Sue Sharp has spent their entire adult lives fighting for this moment. They have endured incompetence, silence, and what they believe to be deliberate obstruction. They have watched their family's murder become a true crime curiosity, discussed by strangers who will never understand what it means to walk through a door and find your mother on the floor. And they are still fighting. In 2025, they will walk into a courtroom and ask a judge to do what no one in 43 years has been willing to do: let the evidence speak for itself. Whatever is in those files, whatever the truth turns out to be, I believe they have earned the right to see it. The dead deserve answers. The living deserve truth. And the system that failed them, in 1981, in every decade since, and perhaps again in 2024, deserves to be held accountable. So here is the question I want to leave you with. It's not the question you're expecting. It's not, who killed the Sharp family? That question may be answered in 2025, or it may remain unanswered forever. The question I want you to think about is this. If a sheriff's office seals the evidence in a quadruple homicide for 40 years, and then names a dead suspect who can never stand trial, and then fights to keep the evidence sealed even after announcing a resolution, what exactly are they protecting? Is it the integrity of the investigation? Or is it something else entirely? What do you think really happened at Cabin 28? And more importantly, do you think we'll ever be allowed to know? Leave your theory below.